The 64th session of the Senate in the first regular session of the 17th Congress is hereby called to order. Let us rise for a minute of silent prayer. Thank you. The Senate choir will lead us in the singing of the Philippine National Anthem. Session suspended. Session resumed. The Secretary may please call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Onasan, Hontiveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Zubiri, Senate President Pimentel.
With 15 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 63rd session, Wednesday, February 15, 2017, and consider the same as approved.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, I would like to acknowledge some guests in the Senate. We have the guests of Senator Gatchalian, the entire delegation of Federation of Fukuoka Prefectural Assembly members for the promotion of international relations, and we have led by the chairman, Mr. Nakao Masayuki of the Fukuoka Prefectural Assembly. Also, we have the guests of Senator Hontiveros, GMA Network, senior students of Diliman Preparatory School, National LGBT Students Network, the Psychological Association of the Philippines, the Association of Transgender People of the Philippines, Mr. President. We'd like to welcome them to the Senate.
To our distinguished guests, welcome to the Philippine Senate. Welcome to your Senate.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with reference of business.
Secretary.
Message from the House of Representatives. Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 13 February 2017, it passed the following House bills in which it requests the concurrence of the Senate House Bill number 833, an act renaming the Monte Vista Catil National Highway traversing the municipality of Compostela Valley, province into the Benigno East Aquino Junior National Highway.
Referred to the Committee on Public Works.
4782, an act renaming the Kai Tikling Antipolo Teresa Morong National Road in the province of Rizal, traversing through the barangay Dolores in the municipality of Taytay up to barangay may bangkal in the municipality of Morong as Corazon C. Aquino Avenue.
to the Committee on Public Works,
House Bill number 1166, an act institutionalizing industry cluster-based programs and projects through interlocal cooperation and people's participation.
to the Committees on Trade, Commerce, and Entrepreneurship, Local Government, and Ways and Means,
House Bill number 4767, an act extending the validity of the Philippine passport, amending for the purpose Section 10 of Republic Act numbered 8239, otherwise known as the Philippine Passport Act of 1996.
to the Committee on Foreign Relations,
4814, an act granting amnesty in the payment of estate tax.
to the Committee on Ways and Means,
4815, an act simplifying the estate tax rate, amending for the purpose Section 84 of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 as amended.
to the Committee on Ways and Means,
4682, an act creating a barangay to be known as Barangay Kumawas in the city of Bislig, province of Surigao del Sur.
to the Committees on Local Government and Electoral Reforms and People's Participation,
Resolution number 293, resolution creating an ad hoc committee tasked to conduct a feasibility study on the construction of a new Senate building and the relocation of the Senate thereto.
to the Committee on Accounts,
Communications, letters from the Bangko Sentral na Pilipinas transmitting to the Senate copies of the following certified and authenticated BSP issuances in compliance with Section 15A of Republic Act number 7653, circular letter number CL-2017-009 dated 26 January 2017, memorandum number M-2017-003 dated 27 January 2017, and circular numbers 944 and 945 dated 6 February 2017.
to the Committee on Banks, Financial Institutions, and Currencies,
Additional referential business, bill on first reading, an act providing a standard of care for the treatment of persons with bleeding disorders, establishing treatment centers, and appropriating funds therefore.
to the Committees on Health and Demography and Finance,
Resolution number 294, resolution congratulating and commending Noel Celis for winning third place in the general news category of the 60th World Press Photo Contest. Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
to the Committee on Rules,
295, resolution expressing the sense of the Senate to join the community of member states of the United Nations in the celebration of International Women's Day 2017, introduced by Senator Maria Lourdes Binay.
to the Committee on Rules. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. President, before the privilege hour, Senator Manny Pacquiao wishes to have the floor for a short manifestation.
Senator Manny Pacquiao is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a manifestation. Last Wednesday, Mr. President, napagkasunduan namin na ngayong araw itutuloy ang interpellation para sa inihain ni Senator Drilon na Senate Resolution 289. I ask for more time to study and discuss this complicated matter. The interpellation for this simple resolution is not in the agenda, but I deem it necessary to make a short manifestation. Mr. President, this sense of the Senate is not a simple resolution, as claimed by the gentleman from Iloilo. Senate Resolution 289 requires the concurrence of the Senate of the termination, withdrawal, abrogation, or renunciation of treaties and international agreements. By treaty or international agreement is vested jointly by the Constitution in the President and the Senate. End of quote. Mr. President, this is wrong. I would like to put on record the statement of Justice Isagani Cruz, who spoke on this matter in his book International Law, and I quote, "Finally, it should be stressed that under the Constitution of the Philippines, the power to ratify treaties and is vested in the President is not, as in commonly believed, in the legislature. The role of the Senate is confined simply to giving or withholding its consent to the ratification. End of quote. Mr. President, the Constitution vested the power to the Senate to concur a treaty or international agreement, but not the abrogation of the treaty. Tayong mga Pilipino bilang may akda ng konstitusyon na siyang pinakamataas na batas sa ating bansa, ang nagbigay ng kapangyarihan sa ating presidente na magdesisyon tungkol sa foreign affairs. The President has the sole power to abrogate a treaty or international agreement. Na-postpone ang committee hearing tungkol sa death penalty dahil pinag-usapan ang Constitution and the international agreement. The Philippine Constitution was ratified by the Filipino people in 1987. The second optional protocol to the ICCPR that calls for the abolition of death penalty was ratified by President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo in 2007. There was no Senate concurrence since it is only treated as an executive agreement. Mr. President, the last time I checked, I did not find anything in the Philippine Constitution that states that international treaties can amend or revise the supreme law of our land. Please tell me if I miss such a provision. Thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity na mapag-usapan ang resolution na ito. Maraming salamat, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Pacquiao.
We take note of the manifestation, Mr. President. I will await any agreement between Senator Dillon and Senator Pacquiao on when we can discuss this on the floor in the meantime. Now, Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Risa Hontiveros to speak on a matter of public interest.
Senator Risa Hontiveros is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. Mr. President, I rise on a point of personal and collective privilege. I lament the vindictiveness of a state that deploys its arsenal of resources to bring down the administration's vocal critic and oppositor, mobilizing all its forces against one woman who dared to point out that the emperor has no clothes. I lament a justice system so desirous of persecuting one woman that it is willing to drop charges against convicted big-time drug lords with everything to gain and nothing to lose, and accept their testimony even sans any other independent corroborative evidence. Laway lang ang puhunan, Mr. President, makakalaya na ang korap at kriminal. Laway lang ang puhunan, may papakulong mo na ang nagsasabi lang ng totoo. I lament the withering of our basic decency and propriety, where constructive criticism is responded to with misogyny, and valid questions on a leader's fitness to lead is met with salacious references to non-existent sex videos, or worse, the pointed barrel of a gun from death squads. I lament the slow death of our democracy, forged by the rich legacy of courage and the heroism of Filipinos who stood up against tyranny, but today dealt blows that punish dissenters, reward sycophants, thrive on fake news, kill the poor, and believe that a cowed population is a good population. But I remain hopeful, Mr. President, defiant and hopeful, dahil patuloy na dumadami ang naniniwala sa kabutihan. Patuloy na dumadami ang lumalaban. Unti-unti nang lumalabas ang buong katotohanan. Yung mga dating kakampi, bumabaligtad na. Nababawasan na ang takot. Dumadami na ang nagsasabi ng totoo. To quote Mahatma Gandhi in closing, Mr. President, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time, they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always." Maraming salamat po, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hontiveros. Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I have a 1-minute suspension?
Session suspended.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to resume consideration of House Bill 4631 under Committee Report Number 36.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, this is the measure renewing for another 25 years the franchise to GMA Network. The parliamentary status of the measure is now, we are now in the period of interpellation, so may I move to recognize the sponsor of the measure, Chairman of the Committee on Public Services, Senator Grace Poe, and to interpellate Senator Ping Lacson.
Senators Poe and Lacson are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the distinguished lady from Quezon City and the Republic of the Philippines yield to some clarificatory questions?
Yes, my pleasure, Mr. President. Actually, that's from Pangasinan and Iloilo.
Pangasinan, Iloilo, Quezon City, and the Republic of the
And San Juan.
Philippines. And San Juan. Mr. President, this is not an opposition to House Bill 4613 as reported out under Committee Report Number 36, because I cannot imagine the world without GMA 7. No? And I cannot also imagine the world without Itbulaga. Anyway, Mr. President, the focus of my interpellation is on Section 4 and probably Section 5. There is an amendment made under the Senate version on Section 4, no? Because under House Bill, under RA 7252, and this is a recurring provision, no? Responsibility to the public. The grantee shall provide adequate public service time to enable the government through the said broadcasting stations to reach the population on important public issues. Now, under the Senate version, there is a committee amendment that says the grantee shall provide free of charge adequate public service time which is reasonable and sufficient to enable the government through the broadcasting stations or facilities of the grantee, etc., etc. My first question is, kindly define adequate public service time.
Mr. President, to answer the question as regards to the meaning or definition of adequate public service time, let me point out that under Section 4, the grantee, which is GMA, should allow the government to do two things. Number one, reach the pertinent population or populations or portions thereof on important public issues, and two, to relay important public announcements and warnings as necessity, urgency, or the law may require. Now, Mr. President, the phrase adequate public service time refers to the length of free airtime to be given by GMA to the government for the latter to be able to meaningfully and effectively carry out the two things it is mandated to do under Section 4. The adequacy, reasonability, sufficiency of the free airtime depends on the specific message, announcement, warning that the government needs to relay to the people. Longer message, announcement, warning shall necessitate a longer airtime for the government. A shorter message or announcement would mean a shorter airtime. Now, the committee deemed it better to state adequate public service time as opposed to giving a fixed specific amount of time in seconds or minutes, because the length of messages and announcements, warnings are not uniform or the same. Various important public issues could not be expected to be explained or relayed to the public in the same or uniform amount of time. In short, the adequate public service time depends on the length of the message, or warning, there should be no free airtime to be wasted, and it should be tailor-fit for each and every specific message, announcement, or warning. Furthermore, Mr. President, GMA 7 cannot limit the government to a certain amount of fixed time in minutes or seconds, thereby compromising the effective, meaningful, and substantial conveyance of any message, announcement, and warning. On the other hand, Mr. President, the phrase or proviso adequate public service time also protects GMA 7 from possible government abuse in such a way that the government cannot demand for a longer free airtime than what is necessary to meaningfully and effectively convey its message, announcement, and warning. Sa madaling salita, Mr. President, dahil sa terminolohiyang adequate public service time, ang libreng oras na dapat ibigay ng GMA sa gobyerno o ang libreng oras na hihingin ng gobyerno sa GMA ay hindi maaaring kulangin at hindi rin maaaring lumabis at nakadepende ito sa haba o iksi ng mensahe na mas maepektibong maipaparating sa ating mga kababayan.
During the committee hearing, even the President and the CEO of GMA 7 admitted that there's vagueness under this provision. No? Ang tanong ko po is, how is this provision under Section 4 different from the provision under Section 5? Yung responsibility to the public of the grantee, how is it different from the provision under the right of the government? No? Kasi parang both would involve taking over of private property. No, my question is, you know, to follow up on my initial question, how is it different from Section 4 in relation to Section 9 of Article 3 of the Constitution, yung Bill of Rights natin, yung just compensation, to be more specific?
Okay. Well, Mr. President, actually, the franchise is a privilege given to this, to certain companies. On the other hand, they also have certain obligations to meet with the government. It's not necessarily just merely taking over without something in exchange for that particular service. So actually, we are not confiscating private property in that case. We are just merely obliging them as part of their compliance for their for their franchise privilege.
Well, in times of emergency or calamity, what are we taking over from the grantee? Kasi nakalagay din sa provision sa Section 5, and this is a special provision granted to the President of the Philippines, which is to take over. Now, what are we taking over? Are we taking over the airtime, the facilities?
Mr. President, the interpretation would be that the government will be allowed to air using the capability of that network to reach out to the population. So if there's an important announcement, when normally maybe the regular programming will be occupying or using a particular time slot, if there's an emergency of national interest, then the government is mandated to take over that airtime because it's a public franchise and they should be able to yield. So in a way, what the government is taking over, based on the question of the good senator from Cavite, the government will be taking over the airtime of this network with, of course, the use of its air
Facilities,
capabilities, transmitters,
So-
etc.
The government will not take over the facilities per se.
Not
It's only
necessarily, no.
it's only the airtime.
Yes, thank
So
you
the
for
technical
clarifying.
people manning the facilities will remain in their posts, and they
Yes.
will be the one to still man the facilities, but government will take over the airtime.
Yes, Mr.
And
President.
that is not that cannot be considered as private property because there's already a decided case. Ito, GMA din ito eh. Telecommunications and Broadcast Attorneys of the Philippines and GMA versus COMELEC, no. Ang ruling po ng korte radio and television broadcast stations do not own the airwaves, and thus, no private property is taken.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
what are we taking over kung yung airtime lang? Eh, hindi naman po private property yon.
Perhaps, Mr. President, we can make an amendment on that particular
Yes,
wording.
just to clarify.
Just to clarify, we will, point taken, Mr. President, I think the Senator from Cavite for the clarification, we should use another term, not take over. Perhaps if there's a suggestion.
About under Section 4, what specific or concrete examples can you enumerate, no? Wherein the TV or radio stations can provide adequate time which is reasonable and sufficient to enable the government. Now, when we say government, what specific departments in government are we referring to?
Well,
Do we also refer to constitutional bodies like the COMELEC or agencies under the executive branch or under the legislature?
Yes, Mr. President, thank you for the clarification. In fact, I think maybe we can put a provision there that since government is really run by people that, by leaders that are chosen by the people, perhaps we can make certain mention of those that are public service announcements like the COMELEC, maybe to give airtime for equal airtime to all listed candidates, or if not that, the NDRRMC for emergency alerts also.
Yes.
They should be granted also that one. And maybe when there's a national crisis, like for the Department of Health, if there's an outbreak of some particular virus or anything that can affect the public in a huge dimension, I think should be given time by the network.
This is not for me or for Senator Honasan, for Senator Soto, simply because I do believe that our competitiveness has diminished, a lot. This is for you, for Senator Ejercito, Senator Angara, and the others who may be running in 2019. No? So
Thank
if
you
we
for
talk
the
of-
consideration. We haven't decided yet.
If we
Mr.
talk
President.
of adequate public service time to enable the government, which is reasonable and sufficient to enable the government, would it also, could it also include COMELEC hour or COMELEC time? I'm just thinking aloud, Mr. President, and I'm thinking of providing, say, because this is a matter of public interest, people running especially for national positions, can not the television stations, radio stations provide a certain number of airtime for the candidates so the people or the electorate will be properly informed of their qualifications, competence while running in office? By the way, how many minutes per hour on a daily basis do the television stations allot for paid commercials, paid advertisements, on the average?
Oh, you know what? This is based on just an observation. I think they're allowed. Is it
18.
For an hour? I think
My
90
information,
minutes
Mr.
of
President, is
commercials.
18 minutes per hour.
20 minutes, yeah, 90 to
18
20
to 20,
minutes.
no?
Yeah.
So, would it be unreasonable for government to, to request for, say, 10% of 18 minutes or 10% of 20 minutes per hour for government use?
Yeah, I think maybe, Mr.
Would the sponsor be amenable to that?
If this is in particular if referring to the elections
Yes.
for candidates, Mr. President, I would be, of course, might be self-serving for me to say yes, why not, right? But perhaps we should amend the election code, because if we impose this requirement on the franchise of GMA 7, we'll also have to impose this on all other network
Of
franchises.
course.
So,
Because this is a recurring provision.
Oh,
This is
so-
a standard provision.
so if this body, anyway, the ABS franchise will also be up next, right? So, if the body will be amenable to that amendment, 10% of
Of,
the
say,
18 to
20
20
minutes,
minutes will be allotted for candidates?
Not just for candidates, because I'm thinking of dividing, say, 2 minutes per hour among the different branches of government. Of course, government is not only the constitutional bodies. Government is also the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch.
But, Mr. President, my only concern would be who in the network will decide which branch of government will
That is my
avail?
next question. Who will supervise?
Yeah, I
Or
think,
who will monitor and supervise the usage of those free of charge?
I think the Joint Committee of the Public Information of the lower and upper and the Senate.
Big.
No,
Very
but
big. No, big.
yes, that would certainly be a big question here, Mr. President. Who will decide which branch of government will have the access to that
And I
3
cannot
minutes?
see CEO Duabit, he's not even shaking his head, so maybe he's in agreement with our proposal.
You're here pala. Oh, okay. So what do you think, sir? What do you think?
Big nga, walang specific number of adequate.
Okay. Mr. President, we will certainly, as we go on, we can get the consensus of the body, but the stakeholders feel that there should be a separate law on this, so that it will be crafted.
This is the best law. That we
Yes,
can-
my only
that we
concern
can
is
make
that
use of.
we need to make sure that if we allot the 10% of the 20 minutes, 18 to 20 minutes, we have to make sure that it is not abused by one particular branch of
Yes.
government.
Say of the
So-
10%, 3% we can allot to the executive branch. Another 3% of the 10% would be allotted to the legislative branch. The other 3% to the judicial branch, and then 1% for the constitutional bodies, including the COMELEC. Would it be sufficient? Would that be reasonable?
Mr. President, I think that also within those branches of government, there might be contention on which executive branch will get the most exposure. So who decides for each branch of government?
That can be worked out, the mechanics, Mr. President.
In the
you know,
IRR?
we're not zeroing in on GMA 7, by the way, because
Okay.
as I said, this is a recurring provision. This is a standard provision for all networks, hindi ba?
Yes, I think maybe what we can do is, because when we put the word adequate, we're not giving a specific time. But if we put this provision, then we will say that at the minimum, because they
At the
might say
minimum,
that
yeah.
that's already the maximum, right? But what if there's like a national calamity that needs to be broadcasted at length? So maybe at a minimum, they will allot 10% of 18 minutes per hour.
My purpose, Mr. President, is not to leave it vague, because, during the committee hearing, di ba, we agreed that merong vagueness dun sa provision. And the antonym of vagueness is clarity, hindi ba? Even specificity. So why don't we just specify the number of minutes, per hour on a daily basis? Kasi pag kinompute po natin yung 18 minutes, for example, per hour, sa 24 hours, mga 432 minutes. So, kung kukuha tayo ng 10% sa 432 minutes, that's 43.2 minutes allotted para sa gobyerno. Serbisyo sa gobyerno.
Hindi naman napakalaki nun.
Hindi
diba?
napakalaki.
Kaya lang,
Tsaka malaki kita nila sa mga advertisements eh.
oo, oo nga.
So, kaya naman nila siguro mag-spare
Ha?
ng say 1.8 to 2 minutes per hour para sa serbisyo gobyerno. Parang kapalit lang naman kasi pinapasa natin yung franchise nila eh.
Mr. President, actually hindi naman sila kasi on air for 24 hours. Although siguro may mga cable channels na gano'n. My concern also is, kunyari magbibigay sila ng 40 minutes every day, baka naman piliin nila yung patay na oras, di ba? So,
And they spread out, Mr. President.
siguro dapat based
Siguro
na
sa IRR, we can work out some mechanics.
So, Mr. President, would the senator from Cavite agree that if we put this particular provision, like 10% of that, how many minutes?
18 or 20 minutes per day,
20
per hour.
per hour, the 10% per hour of the 20 minutes, will be the minimum, not the maximum. Because baka
Yes,
sabihin
Mr.
nila,
President.
wala, 40 minutes na, we already complied with it.
And I repeat that this is for you, for Senator Ejercito, for Senator Angara.
No,
It's
I-
not for us because, you know, kami ni na Senator Soto, we see more through the rear view mirror than we could see through the front windshield.
No ko naman.
No? Andiyan na kami sa stage ng buhay na ganyan.
For
Kaya
the record
ito
to,
na
Mr.
lang yung legacy
President.
na inisip naming iiwanan sa inyo. Yung
Nako.
kasama si Senator Loren pala doon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the generosity of the good gentleman. However, I refuse to merely accept it as a benefit to us. I think that
No, I'm just joking.
Yeah,
That was
no.
said in jest, Mr.
it
President.
is a government service should be accessible and for the benefit of all.
Of all,
So
yes.
if we are going to accept this particular provision, we should make sure that it is not subject to abuse, and that if we specify this or provide this for GMA, rest assured that the next one applying for franchise will be under this
Oh, yes,
regulation as well.
definitely. Anyway, Mr. President, at the proper time, during the period of amendments, maybe we can craft the proper language. Kasama na si Senator Escudero, doon sa sinasabi ko. Anyway, at the proper time, Mr. President, would you allow us to, you know, craft the proper language?
We would certainly welcome that. As also we know, we need to decide on this as soon as possible.
Thank
Because we
you.
don't want them operating without a permit.
Hindi,
Mr.
hindi pa,
President.
hindi pa.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's all, Mr. President, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
you,
President. Thank
Senator
you,
Lacson.
Senator.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Nick Sabiri for the continuing interpellation and then the minority leader, Mr. President.
Would the lady senator from Iloilo and Pangasinan accept a few questions from this representation?
Okay, yes, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you for her being gracious enough to accept. Mr. President, mine is really more of a manifestation because we all go through elections here and we go through national elections, Mr. President. First of all, let me on the onset say that I'm fully supportive of the franchise of GMA 7. As a matter of fact, in the last election, they were very fair, even with their pricing on commercials for the political campaign. They were the cheaper of the two big giants. Less expensive, I would not say cheaper, less expensive, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to ask the good sponsor, she's also the chairperson of the Public Services Committee. Every elections, we have to contend with very expensive commercials. I personally believe, Mr. President, that these expensive commercials promote corruption rather than promoting transparency. Why? If you know how much a commercial is for a 30-second political ad, Mr. President, if the public actually knows it, they will fall off their seats. Because for the information of the body, in the last election, me, together with Senator Ralph Recto, Senator Risa Hontiveros, Senator Joel Villanueva, Senator Sherwin Gatchalian, Senator Dick Gordon, sino pa? Senator Manny Pacquiao, although he does not need commercials because he's already world-renowned, we all had to pay. The most expensive being 989,000 pesos for a 30-second ad. Now, I'm not sure, well, I believe also Senator Grace Po also had to pay the same because she also ran for presidential elections. Together with Senator Drilon, apparently also, I forgot, the big man from the Senate, had also his ads. My point being, Mr. President, I know this might not be the proper I'd say bill for it because this is only on one particular franchise. But would the honorable sponsor be amenable that we now tackle a measure that will finally cap a price for political ads so that the next batch of future senatorial balls and even congressional candidates, even presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates will have a fighting chance of putting their ads and airtime on these major networks. Would she be amenable, Mr.
Yes,
Chair?
Mr. President, why not? I mean, if it's for the greater good, then if, as the gentleman from Bukidnon states, that it will help decrease corruption.
Yes, would the lady agree with me, Mr. President, that you will have to go to not, if you are not as rich as, I'd say, Ma'am Cynthia Villar, our colleague here, who has a lot of financial wealth to be able to, capacity to be able to pay for the commercials. The true honest, in all honesty, Mr. President, we have to knock on many doors, to ask for support. Sell properties, knock on doors for help. That's the honest truth about it. To be able to come up with this type of funding to be able to pay for the commercials. I'd like to ask, to move to another point, I'd like to ask the lady senator, how much was the advertising cost for a 30-second ad aired on GMA 7 in the last elections, Mr. President?
It depends
Prime
what it depends what time. They have a tier. Usually, if it's prime time, it's a little bit more. About 500,000 at an average for 30
500,000. So they were not the ones charging 989,000. Must be another network, Mr. President. And we appreciate the fact that GMA 7 had not increased the rates since 2013, because I also had run in the 2013 elections. So we appreciate the fact that they kept it stable, the pricing for political ads. Mr. President, also for the attention of the body, we filed Senate Bill number 307, which is to regulate the political ads on political exercises. Would the lady agree with me, Mr. President, maybe what we could do? Because what is happening, Mr. President, is 6 months before the elections, if the elections is on May, on January, they increase all ad rates. They increase it. Gagawin nilang doble. And then papatungan nila ng discount. Parang labas, din-discount nila. But they double the rates. That's why, I mean, because under the law, I think in the COMELEC, I think there was a election code wherein the airtime should be given preferential discounts. So binigyan nga ng discounts pero they double it before the elections. So my proposal, if the lady would agree with me, if she thinks it's sound or she can comment on it now, would we be willing, that we now go backwards 1 year? What the preferential rate card is, a year prior to the elections, which all Procter & Gamble, all these hair shampoo, this toothpaste, all they pay a year prior to the elections. We get that cap, the tag, that amount, and then we give the discount. So that way, we have a clear idea on how much the true rate of commercials would be. Would the lady senator agree to that proposal?
I share the concern of the senator from Bukidnon. I know how it's difficult to come up with campaign funds to remain competitive during the campaign season. But perhaps even if it will benefit us directly, I think being fair also to the others that were granted franchises before, in the past, I think we should draft a separate law detailing those particular provisions on the election code and also
I agree.
airtime.
I agree, Mr. President. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned earlier, this may not be the bill for it, but I'd like to manifest it because this is, we're discussing telecom, we're discussing a broadcast franchise, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, and as I mentioned, we have a Senate bill now on board, which is Senate Bill number 307. That's all, Mr. President. I don't want to take much of our time. It's just that you can see the frustration that each and every one here feels every time there's an election campaign season. It's so difficult for well-meaning, highly qualified individuals to actually run in national campaigns because the cost is too prohibitive. It has nothing to do anymore with the organization. It's only commercials now. Ang labanan is social media and television. Sana naman po, may baba natin yung presyo ng advertising rates para sa ganun na may mga well-deserving candidates not being deceived by adverts from political advertising that can actually run in the elections. Kasi itong mga well-deserving candidates, hindi nila kaya bayaran ang political ad rates na 1 million. Let me repeat, 1 million per 30 seconds, and this was in 2016. I am so afraid for our colleagues who are going to run in the 2019 elections. Kasi kung 30% yung increase nila every year, then expect to pay close to 1.4 million per 30 seconds in your candidacies on 2019. So I hope that we can fast-track an approval of this particular measure, get the House to support it. I believe we should all be unanimous because mahirap yung hindi susuporta dito, sasabihin na pinaboran yung TV networks. Dapat solid po tayo in support of this because this is for political reform so that we can get not better qualified, but more qualified candidates to run for national office. Not only for the Senate, but for the presidency and the vice presidency, Mr. President. So I thank the honorable lady for the time. Thank you.
We appreciate those points raised by the gentleman from Bukidnon. As I've mentioned, we could craft another law, but also for the consideration of our colleagues here, as you know, the networks actually make the biggest profit during an election year. So we are going to be against a lot of those that will disagree with this.
Mr. President.
But I think that we have to, this is important for political reforms.
Mr. President, just a reaction to that. But Mr. President, I agree with the lady, but we must be tough. Why? Because when it comes to times that we slip up in the Senate, one small slip up, we are attacked. We are attacked almost on a daily basis on radio and TV, and when we ask for time, equal time to speak out, we're never given to us, Mr. President. So my point being is, we have to be able to also institute a mechanism so that we can air our grievances through TV ads. That's the only way because we have no right to reply. But if the TV ads are so prohibitive, we cannot reply to these accusations against us, Mr. President. So I know they make the biggest amount of money during election period, but let's not take advantage of the candidates because that is taking advantage of the candidate. And ang gagawin ng kandidato, gagastos ng 5 billion pag presidential, gagastos ng 1 billion pag senator, gagastos din ng billion. Of course, hindi na sasabi billion, pero billion talagang ginastos. Ang problema po dyan, paano nila babawiin yung pera kung sinong interest groups ang nilapitan nila para bigyan sila ng pera, and the vicious cycle continues, Mr. President. We have to start once and for all with this political reform agenda, and one of them is to be able to come up with affordable rates for advertising during elections. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Subiri.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, just a side comment. I'm glad that we're discussing this proposal. This is a better proposal than a proposal before in the previous Congress, which goes back to the repeal of the law, lifting the ad ban. So palagi ko mas papayag ng mga network dito sa proposal na to instead of that repeal. Anyway, Mr. President, for the record, again, I have already disclosed my association with the network. So at this point, may we recognize the Minority Leader, Senator Ralph Recto.
The Minority Floor Leader, Senator Recto, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. I just wanted to make a comment, Mr. President, and maybe at the appropriate time, ask questions to the sponsor of this measure. But before doing that, Mr. President, I associate myself with the sponsor that we must give the franchise of an extension to GMA with regard to its franchise My only concern are two issues, Mr. President. The first being the deletion of the tax provisions in the particular franchise. Maybe at the period of amendments, we will insert the tax provisions in this franchise, Mr. President. Would the sponsor be amenable to inserting the tax provisions required under any franchise passed by Congress, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. I think that they have to be compliant with any tax provisions that will come after the franchise is approved. So we will put that in the general regulations.
No, Mr. President. What I'm saying is that in all franchises that Congress passes, we have tax provisions. In this particular franchise, tinanggal yung tax provision. And it will look bad for Congress in a special law not to have these tax provisions. It might appear that we're giving exemptions when GMA is not asking for any exemption. The interest of GMA is just to extend their franchise.
Yes, I think, Mr. President, from what I understand, there's already an NIRC tax on VAT. And I think that has already replaced what was originally stated in their franchise agreement, which was the 3% franchise tax. But maybe just to clarify it, would the gentleman from Batangas want that included, that they pay the VAT and other taxes that they're obliged to pay?
Basically, the franchise is a contract between the state and the network in this case. And in that contract, there must be tax provisions. And we're not adding any taxes that they're not paying today. Neither are they asking for any exemptions. So I think it is only proper to have a tax provision in this contract between the state and the proponent.
They're duly noted, Mr. President, and we are amenable to make that amendment. They are not
Thank you.
requesting for any special tax
Privileges.
exemption.
Correct, that is correct. The second point, Mr. President, is that I was listening to the periods of interpolation earlier. The problem with some of the suggestions made by our colleagues earlier is that you cannot put all those amendments in this franchise because there will be undue advantage. For example, if we require Channel 7 to give 10% of all their minutes for free to the state, for example, and that is not required in the franchise of ABS-CBN or Channel 5 or the other stations, then there will be a problem, Mr. President. So the idea is that Channel 7, Channel 2, Channel 5, and all those who have a broadcast franchise should be treated equally. Is that correct?
I agree, Mr. President, yes.
Okay.
So this is, the suggestion of the gentleman from Bukidnon should be duly noted as another.
Should be in another bill, if at
Bill.
all, maybe the Fair Election Code. Similarly, the proposals made earlier by the gentleman from Cavite may be in a special law, maybe a broadcasting law for that matter. Halimbawa, in the telecommunications industry, you have the Public Telecommunications Act. That
Right.
would be in a general law, not in the franchise of the proponents.
Yes. Thank you for agreeing with that particular opinion as well. Senator
So
Sha-
with that, Mr. President, I have no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Recto. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. President, may we recognize Senator Chis Escudero for just one or two questions, Mr. President.
Senator Escudero is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one question, actually. On page 3, line 8, the word reasonable was amended to be replaced by the word adequate. Just for legislative intent purposes, do I take it that adequate presupposes a bigger airtime than the word reasonable? More airtime based on need, of course, when you use the word
Actually,
adequate.
The word adequate and reasonable are still there. Adequate meaning, this is the
Tatanggalin na po
exact...
yung reasonable to replace it with the word adequate.
No. The grantee shall provide free of charge adequate public service time which is reasonable and sufficient to enable the government through broadcasting stations or facilities or the grantee to reach pertinent populations. So I'm not sure I understand the question of the good senator from Sorsogon, but adequate is there and also reasonable.
As the bill appears, Mr. President, it says the grantee shall provide, and then you deleted the word reasonable? And replace it with the word adequate.
Yes, we are actually putting this back in the
You're putting
committee
it back.
amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Senator Escudero. Majority Floor Leader.
May we recognize Senator Senator Dick Gordon. We will then Senator Legarda and then Senator Villanueva, Mr. President.
Senator Gordon is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the outset, I'd like to say that I think that all TV stations must really be protected. Broadcasting stations are part of the pillar of a democracy. However, as pointed out already by Senator Subiri, at times there are aberrations that occur, and that can be addressed by the government. And therefore, my first question is, a franchise is not a right, it is a privilege. And therefore, it is subject to conditions and limitations. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
And if that is so, I don't see any limitations on the franchisee right now.
You don't see any.
Are there any limitations that have been outlined?
There are obligations, Mr. President, as to what they should be able to provide, like adequate public service, exposure for any announcement by the government, for example.
What is happening in the United States right now is a war between the President of the United States and the media. In fact, the President is going directly to the people, even campaigning in Florida, and at the same time, it is now Twitter exposition of presidential policy, which is quite dangerous, which occurs when some stations take sides in political contests. With the franchise holder, do you know, if the franchise holder has a track record for taking sides?
Mr. President, our franchise holder, the one that would like to renew the privilege, has always prided itself as being fair, walang kinikilingan, walang pinoprotektahan. Well, serbisyong totoo. Ngayon, maybe their consistent patronage by the people affirms that they are delivering on what they are promising. I personally have watched certain segments of their news, and actually their news in general, and I think that on the whole they should be commended for what they present. I think that they're pretty, in my particular observation, I think they've been fair, except for certain commentators in their network.
I agree
And
with
I
you.
can name them, actually.
I agree with the gentle lady that I believe the GMA has been very balanced. But I sometimes have to express my deep reservations because sometimes some stations go overboard to the point of campaigning, to the point of really addressing certain issues in a manner that is no longer objective. That's why a franchise is a reserved right. It is not open to every member of the public. It is given to certain individuals, certain corporations, to make sure that the public will be properly informed. And as GMA has always said, walang kinikilingan, walang sinasamahan.
Pinoprotektahan, servisyon totoo lang.
That's right. And I believe them. I believe them. I think that they're the better, if not the best, at the moment. And I hope they're listening because I'm about to change my tone.
No, you know what? The senator from Bukidnon just distracted our.
Yes, you know, sometimes the senator
Resource
from Bukidnon
person.
can be very pesky.
But in reality, Mr. President, the point that I would like to raise is there ought to be some limitations, and sometimes the limitations come too late. For example, in the COMELEC law, even in the Constitution, the COMELEC has the power to limit the franchises of all broadcast and TV stations and radio stations. Is that correct?
Yes, of course. During campaign, I think they're allowed, candidates only allowed 180 minutes. Actually, to my disappointment, it's per network. It would have been more equitable and more tenable if it was 180 minutes for all networks.
I'm not there yet. I'm
Okay.
not there yet. I'm not in
Oh,
the-
you're going there too? Yes.
No. Because when, that is for the COMELEC, in terms of electoral expenses. Because my own view, Mr. President, and I'm letting our fellow senators kind of go into the direction of thinking about a situation where the government pays for TV time. Not the candidate, but the government pays for TV time so that debates can be undertaken,
I don't know.
so that there can be no question
It's a compliment.
that some people are under the heel of certain interest groups, so much so that there is more comfort in the fact that our senators, our presidents are not paid for or bought or influenced or under the heel. This is something devoutly to be wished, as I'm sure the gentle lady will agree. And so therefore, my own thinking on the matter is, if we cannot limit the franchise, which is a privilege, if the gentle lady doesn't want to outline the limitations, especially during elections, or for that matter, limitations which border on the First Amendment, freedom of speech, as is happening in the United States now, where the president himself is saying, I don't want to talk to you, you're fake news. And we don't have to go to that area. So it's important that when we craft legislation, we must be very clear to make sure that we stick within the constitutional limitations. But at the same time, this is not a right, this is a privilege. And if there's a right, there's always a concomitant duty, and with more reason when it's a privilege. For every right, there's a duty. And if it's a privilege, there's more demand for objectivity and to make sure that the news that is going to come out will benefit the country in terms of proper information, correct analysis of the issues, especially in this era of very, very high-speed news, that there is no more time to analyze. And so therefore, I will go back to the provision of the Constitution, and I will remind everybody, Article 9 under Section 4 says, the COMELEC may, during the election period, supervise or regulate the utilization of all franchises or permits for the operation of media of communication or information, all grants, special privileges, or concessions by the government. But you know, in reality, when that happened, they went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said it was a transgression of of the right or the freedom of speech or the freedom of information by the media. So, how do we see our way clear on this matter, Your Honor? How does the gentle lady see its way clear on this matter when no less than the Supreme Court says the COMELEC cannot regulate the radio time, the TV time, or even the amounts? Because it really is a problem, and it really is dangerous for our democracy when all of us have to go to the powers that be in this country and are subject to their whim and caprice later on when we accept money. And I'm sure the owners of Channel 7 or GMA will not allow that to happen. And that's why I'm asking the gentle lady, not just for GMA, but for all TV franchises that we're going to enact here, that we must enact legislation to protect our country and our public from such a happening. That's why media is reserved 100% to Filipino citizens. Because if it wasn't, then, you know, other countries might buy into our media and influence us. And that is why I do not want to see our media having foreign influence. And for that, I would like an assurance that in return, they will allow access, equal access to media in terms of advertising, equal access to media, especially with the complaint by most politicians that when they're attacked, that they should be allowed an answer. I believe the father of no less than the Senate President had that a proposal once upon a time, the right to reply. I'm not sure I'm supportive of all that on all fours, because again, that's an intrusion that could be interpreted as an intrusion. But upon the other hand, it is important that we understand what we are approving today. By the way, I'm supportive of the franchise be granted, but I'm going to have to make sure that in future legislation, it must be ironclad that the Supreme Court cannot be influenced. I'm not saying it was influenced in the last hurdle, but you can see at times, as one book said, some are more equal than others in this country. So, Madam, the gentle lady, I hope, can comment on that. I'd like to hear her thoughts on the matter.
Yes, thank you for the manifestation of the good senator. I believe we do not have a general broadcast policy law, which perhaps the good senator would like to file. This law should cover all broadcast media and not just the franchisee. It will also be able to spell out exactly what their obligations should be to the government. As Senator Lorenzo Tariada said, that the granting of franchise is actually a granting of grace to these.
Perhaps, I wonder if, I mean, of course, when we talk about the franchise, we must talk about everybody is going to apply for a franchise. I think the statements made by Senator Subiri a while ago has that intention to make sure that we are not unfairly controlled or eventually controlled. Cannot the media be able to charge the rich owners of big corporations? Because I am not in support of limiting the price of media. I'm just in support of making sure that those who will become representatives of the country or the presidents of the country will not be subject to that kind of suasion. However, I want to make sure that those who can afford the media, like big corporations, can pay for better salaries for the media people working on these broadcast franchise owners, so that there is no sacrifice in the quality and in the integrity of the franchise holders. But when it comes to democracy, I would hazard that proposal that all of us hearken to the fact that government should be the ones to raise the money, and there should be no TV ad, as Senator Soto suggests a while ago to me, but they can sponsor TV debates for presidents and senators on a regional basis so that everybody ends up a winner. Would the gentle ladies, franchise holders be amenable to such a task? I'm just fishing here. Otherwise, I would have to cut bait.
Perhaps, Mr. President, a separate law again that will determine exactly what the obligations would be. Why not a public debate and forum is always helpful. In fact, Mr. President, personally, I think that the major networks have done this already repeatedly, and it's a top rating show for them whenever there's a public debate. However, you know, when the candidates are not only limited to the popular names, especially the ones filing for the Senate, you have numerous candidates. So it's also kind of difficult to get the proper exposure in a debate for everyone. So, well, I guess if we're going to craft a law, we might as well ask for the maximum that we can and add specifically per candidate to come out.
Well, America had a lot of presidential candidates last time in the primaries, especially, and they were able to control that debate. I'd rather have a debate rather than have innocuous and silly, commercials where the candidates dance, where the candidates do all kinds of foolish things and get elected because they're funny.
But you know what? For some, they might actually appreciate those dances more. No, I'm just kidding, Mr. President. I think that, yes, the debates would certainly be more informative. But again, we have a way of deciding how best we should present ourselves to the public, and then ultimately it's the public who should decide.
And the public hasn't decided very well, as perhaps some of you will debate in the case of America or in the case of even of the Philippines right now. And perhaps because there's
Your
not been
words,
enough,
not, mine,
there's not been
Mr.
enough
President.
debates, or for that matter, at some other time in our history.
Yes, Mr. President, all of these points being raised by the good senator is actually well taken, and I think that we will, I will await for that proposed bill to amend our broadcasting laws.
Well, this is fishing, really, so that we can find out later on when we do so, we would have the political will to be able to do that. Because right now, stations will be asking us for their franchises, and we will grant them, and when they have the franchise, they may not be so willing to grant all these limitations and these protective measures for our public. I wonder if you might take a while to listen to the confession of
yes.
some of the people beside you who are friends of mine as well.
Yes, actually, Mr. President, it will be in their franchise that they have to comply with general broadcasting laws. Aside from that particular provision that will ensure that if we have the political will to pass that reform bill, then they have to comply. Now, as to the commitment of our resource person, okay, but would you, okay. They will comply with the law. Of course, they have to comply with the law.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I've never doubted that. Like I said, I was going to vote for this in the first place. I just wanted to, if I may be immodest, I wanted to load the record with statements like this so that when we go later on to the specific task of legislation, we can go back to the record and remind everybody that there was some congruence of support for the kind of things that we want so that we would have a better democracy.
I think, Mr. President, this good initiative by the senator from Zambales should really be one of our top priorities. It should be done, not the year of the elections or the year before the elections. I think
Long
it should
before
be
the
done.
election.
Right. I think the perfect timing is when we begin again in June or in July. We should start the debates on that already.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's all I wanted to ask so that we can put it on the record and make everybody aware of our responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. President, before I move to recognize Senator Legarda, just as a rejoinder to the point raised by Senator Dick Gordon, the issue on foreign influence, and that as far as the Constitution is concerned, media should be 100% Filipino. May I ask the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Public Services, what does that make CNN Philippines?
Mr. President, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, I was pointing out the point raised by Senator Gordon, which is on the issue of foreign influence and the media being 100% Filipino, based on the Constitution. And my question was, what does that make CNN Philippines?
Actually, Mr. President, these are one of the things that will have to be considered as as there is also a move to amend the Public Services Act. I think also, like, when it comes to foreign ownership on certain industries. But when it comes to CNN Philippines, yes, the franchise holder, perhaps in the Philippines, is a Filipino company. They are paying a franchise fee. CNN International does not necessarily control this network here.
Well, the shows being shown are all CNN shows, most, about 50%.
Yes,
Or-
but Mr. President, they also have local talk shows that are produced primarily by the CNN producers in the Philippines.
Yes, but does that comply with the 100% Filipino as manifested by Constitution? Senator Drilon wants to
Yes, I
interject,
think-
Mr. President.
Yes,
With
Mr.
permission
Drilon
of
is recognized.
Senator Soto,
Yes.
the Constitution requires equity by Filipinos in mass media. Is it 100%? 100%. I believe CNN Philippines is 100% owned by Filipinos. Equity is 100% owned by Filipinos. But they have, as the good sponsor said, they have contracts with CNN for them to use CNN as a trademark in payment of a certain fee, and also programming coming from CNN. But basically, the equity is with
Ownership.
Filipino citizens, which complies with the Constitution.
You're saying that ownership is 100% Filipino. All right, thank you, Mr. President. And then just one point for the record, Mr. President. When we passed the Fair Election Practices Act of 2001, I was Vice Chairman of then Senator Raul Roco. We lifted the political ad ban. And on record, what was agreed was 120 minutes per candidate for television and 180 minutes per candidate for radio. I wonder where the Supreme Court ruling came from when they said that it is 120 minutes per station. I don't know which of the stations lobbied, but definitely that was not what we passed, Mr. President. Anyway, Senator Loren Legarda, Mr. President, wishes to be recognized.
Senator Legarda is recognized.
Before I ask my questions for my education and enlightenment, I'd just like to concur with the majority leader, because I was the majority leader then, Mr. President, and he was the minority leader. And in fact, it was during our time, it was so clear. You can look at the archives and the records that it was 180 per candidate and 120 respectively, but it did not say per station, per network, per province, per region. I think it's been abused. And I don't want my colleagues in media to begrudge us for this, but I just want to confirm what the majority leader, who was then minority, is saying. It was not intended to be a free-for-all, unlimited, because right now, it's really unlimited, and it can be very, very expensive. And so, I just wanted to clarify some of the points that Senator Lacson had raised. And before that also, I just wanted to put on record, just like Senator Soto did, I started my television career in Channel 7 in 1978. Contrary to what people think, that I started in ABS-CBN, yes, I did post-EDSA, but in 1978 in martial law, it was in 1978 when I started in a Sunday quiz program with former Senator Orlando Mercado. So just so that it's also clarified on record that I worked with a network, and therefore I have this few questions. Earlier, Senator Lacson was asking about the 1 hour allocation for commercial ads. I went to Mr. Duavit, again for transparency. Mr. Duavit, his father, and us, we are family friends, but I am supporting the renewal of the franchise, not because we're family friends, but because GMA 7 has to be supported. I cannot go off the air on March 20. But just for my clarification, a 1-hour program has an allocated number of minutes for commercial placements. Is that not correct, Madam Sponsor?
Yes, Mr.
Mr. President,
It's
yes.
usually about 18 to 20 minutes.
That's why I wanted to clarify, because the Kalusanang broadcasters ng Pilipinas would have a number of minutes, at least during my time, in World Tonight, in ABS-CBN in 86, and even before then, till I retired in 98. How about for GMA 7, which is not a member of KBP? So, what is the exact number of minutes that could be allocated for commercial placements for a 1-hour program? May I know, Mr. President, for GMA 7 at least?
Yes. Mr. President, this is also good that the senator from
Everywhere.
Malabon
Malabon, Antique, San Pablo, Marikina,
raised.
and the Philippines.
Thank you for that
Okay.
clarification. Raised because it's true, GMA 7 is not a member of the KBP.
Yes.
So they're basically doing their own self-regulation as to the number of minutes, but they still have to be viable, because if in an hour show their ads are 35 minutes or 30 minutes, I'm sure people will just migrate to another network. Right? So I think they're applying what is scientifically been proven, maybe the maximum tolerance,
18.
which is 20 minutes.
That's quite a lot. For a 1-hour show, you have 40 minutes running time, and you have 20 minutes for commercial placements. And for prime time, at your most expensive slot, during this time, a non-election year, how much would a 30-seconder cost for a, let's say, 7 to 8 p.m. prime time slot on a weekday? Just an average, an estimate. Would it be 500,000 pesos for 30 seconds? Okay, half a
About
million.
400,000,
More or less,
yeah.
400 to 500,000. 400,000. Okay, 400,000 for a prime time slot. So 20 minutes. So 400,000 pesos times 40 slots. Correct. Yes, correct. 400 times 40, because 20 minutes. But of course, not all programs are sold totally, and that's the maximum. May I know, Mr. President, which government entity, if any, or regulatory body, private or government, if any, would actually put a cap or a limit to the number of commercials a television network can put in its television programs, and the same goes with radio?
Mr. President, commercials are technically the earnings of the network, and I don't think the government has any regulation as to the amount that a particular network can earn. So they're allowed to get as many commercials, but again, their patronage might suffer if they become too greedy and unreasonable.
Okay, so I understand it to mean then, Mr. President, that the station, once it airs a station-produced television program, can sell as much commercial spots as possible. However, if the airtime is sold to a block timer, there is a cap on the number of spots. May I therefore know, if your airtime for 1 hour is sold to Senator Soto as producer, take, for example, what are the number of minutes, if any? How much is the cap for that 1 hour program? Because the block timer cannot sell more than X number of spots if you're a block timer.
Actually, Mr. President, I think that was the case during the elections. Certain block timers were only allowed to allot a portion of their airtime for ads for candidates. So I'd like to have that clarified.
Yeah.
The block timers actually limited
you
to
can
the
answer
number
this
of
kasi
ads that they
magkano
can
ang-
sell.
Magkano ang inyong ano eh. You see my point? I'm just trying to say, if it's a station-produced show, unlimited. You can sell up to 30 minutes, 35 minutes. But if it's block time, GMA 7, you have a contract with block timers. How much or how many minutes are you allowing your block timers to sell their spots? It's part of the contract.
Okay. Mr. President, I think they're allowed to sell as much ads as they can. The only reason why this is this is the manifestation of our resource person. The only reason why they had to limit political ads during a campaign period is because it is limited against the 180 hours per candidate per network.
Yes.
So basically, it's taking out from possible income that will go directly to the GMA network because it is going to their block timer
Understood.
instead.
However, I'm not asking during political season. I'm asking during normal times as this. If I were to block time a 1-hour slot, how many minutes can a block timer sell? Or does it have the same rule as the television station owner that the time would be unlimited, meaning there is no cap of 15 minutes, 18 minutes, or 30 minutes? There's no.
There's no
There's
limit.
no rule.
No.
Okay. And for a station such as GMA 7, which is not regulated by the kapisanan ng mga broadcasters sa Pilipinas, since you're the only television network that is not a member of the KBP, how would we monitor, regulate, maybe regulate is not the right term, find out how many minutes can be sold? So, based on the earlier answer, it would be depending on how many will be sold, but they will not abuse because it would not be good for the viewers as well. Is that the answer? So no one actually is above you that could tell you hanggang 15 minutes lang kayo.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because my experience, Mr. President, is entirely different. When I was anchoring The World Tonight and producing the Inside Story in the 80s up to the 90s, we would have a running time of a television program for 1 hour because there would be an allocation for commercial time, and we could not go beyond, in terms of commercial time, X number of minutes, maybe 12 to 15 minutes. I don't recall the number of minutes. After 15 minutes, we cannot sell, even if there were advertisers who wanted to place spots on the program. So are we saying then that ABS-CBN at the time, I belonged to that network, GMA 7 now has a different policy because they're not covered by KBP? Kasi ang ABS may cap sigurado ako. Nung panahon ko, I don't know how it is now.
I'm not familiar either, Your Honor, of how it is now.
Yeah.
So, Mr.
There
President,
is no
from what
cap.
I gather, this is all self-regulation, and the only GMA 7 is not restricted by government to sell as much ad time. There's no broadcasting regulation that will limit them to do so. Just a private organization would have done so, which is the KBP, but since they're not a member, they're not compelled to follow that anyway.
Okay, that's clear. Now, I'd like to pursue the point of Senator Lacson. I believe that he had a suggestion that for matters of national interest, like DRR warnings, for example, or even information materials on PhilHealth on how to access it, and Pag-ibig, and many others of national interest that would benefit the Filipino people, how much of the 1 hour airtime could be made available for these government plugs? But it should be very strict in its implementation so that it is not used by politicians with their faces and their voices being heard, assuming they are running for an elective office.
Yes, actually, Mr. President, we are awaiting also the suggested amendments by the good senator from Cavite regarding this one. But we still maintain that this should be a separate law to cover all stations and not just this particular
Of course.
franchise.
In fact, what we would suggest now, if this will apply with GMA 7, it should apply with all others that will renew their franchise. Yes,
Yes.
for parity. Of
Yes,
course.
so it will be a
Hindi lang si
separate
GMA.
regulation.
Pati si Gabi. So, Senator Lacson says that it will be 10% of the allocated airtime for placements, assuming the placement time is 20 minutes, it would be 10%, so 2 minutes allocated per hour. So I would join the senator from Cavite and the Philippines in that amendment in providing the Filipino people a voice and national government agencies for information of public interest to be aired for a 10%, but that can be studied, portion of the portion allocated for commercial placements.
10% of the
No,
19 to
10%
20
per hour.
minutes.
Meaning, what Senator Lacson propounded was, if in an hour, 20 minutes is the commercial airtime, 10% of the 20 minutes is 2 minutes or 4 30-second spots for commercials, let's say on HIV/AIDS, let's say on how to access a pag-ibig housing loan, how to avail of PhilHealth programs that would benefit our people, but not to use the face and names and voices of people in elective office. Tama ba yun? Maliban sa mga hindi natatakbo kamukha ko.
Mr. President,
Hindi, joke lang. Hindi. So, ganun ang ibig mo sabihin, 10% nung allocated time.
Mr. President,
Senator Soto, the majority
with the
Leader,
permission of the two beautiful women of the Senate, may I interject a point on what they are discussing?
Please proceed.
Thank you. Mr. President,
Kasi black pa.
the proposal is laudable, but we will have to get down to pencil and paper, because there are intricacies. Like, for example, in the case of a show being shown on Channel 7, on GMA Network, entitled Eat Bulaga, there is a portion there which is called One for All for One. That is a portion where they go to the barangays and collect garbage and turn it into chairs to be distributed to schools. It takes an hour for the entire portion. There are no commercials. So what do you do with that?
If you say that,
Oh.
if you say that the subject matter of your show has laudable content, that is your duty as a public servant.
No, whether laudable or comedy or whatever, it is one hour.
No, you're correct. And many other programs, so for example, a documentary. A documentary would be informational, but despite that, we can actually put X number of spots for materials from national government agencies for information to the public.
All right,
think, Mr.
let us be specific, Mr. President. In the case of Eat Bulaga, 2 hours and a half, we have self-regulated. We're limited to 36 minutes. That is the regulation that the company has placed upon itself. GMA knows that.
Mr. President,
36 minutes. So in 36 minutes, how much are we going to allot for?
Yeah.
Will it be the producer or will it be the corporation or the network?
I have a
that will
suggestion,
provide?
Mr. President, that will make the majority leader / producer happy. We will limit it to station produced and not to block timers, because block timers definitely have to recoup their investments because they're paying for the airtime.
No, I think
While the
that's-
network owners own the airtime.
Mr. President,
Station
I
produced.
would like a word in here, being the main sponsor of this measure. First of all, as mentioned by the Majority Leader, this is a very intricate matter that needs to be discussed separately in another hearing for another bill. Now, when it comes to just granting, exempting block timers, I don't agree. I believe that the law should apply to all. If we are going to adopt something like this, I think the best is 10% of any time that they allot for ad time. Not the entire 10% of 1 hour. Let's say 10% of 20 minutes, as initially suggested by Senator Honasan. I'm sorry, Mr. Senator Lacson. They belong to the same group, but same league. But I understand the concern also and the frustrations of my colleagues here, because I feel that we are under public scrutiny in the media and the news, but when it comes to us also promoting our advocacies, it's very difficult to get attention and coverage from the media. And also, I also sympathize with the producer. It takes a lot also to be able to produce. But if One for All, for example, is an hour of straight content programming, then they don't have to comply with the 10% within that 1 hour because none is allotted for ads. On the other hand, there's also such a thing as ad placements, which can go within the actual program. But never mind, that's another time. Thank you, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, at the appropriate time, I would join Senator Lacson once we have done pencil pushing and really assessing what is doable for the networks. Because clearly, the networks are privately owned and they own the airtime. But since we are passing the franchise and a part of the airtime can be devoted to the public interest, because not sometimes, more often than not the whole 20 minutes is really utilized for private ad placements, then we can utilize a part of that for public interest informational materials. So I leave it to you whether it's 10% of whichever. I would just join Senator Lacson and other colleagues in introducing that amendment, which will be applicable not only for GMA 7, but all other stations thereafter.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the manifestation of both senators who are TV veterans and would know the industry.
Thank you, Senator Legarda.
Finally, Mr. President. Finally, Mr. President, Senator Joel Villanueva.
Senator Villanueva is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Majority Floor Leader. The onset, I would just like to put on record that this representation would like to associate himself to the statements made by our colleagues, Senator Lacson, Senator Mig Subiri, insofar as political ads is concerned during election period. Mr. President, I would also like to manifest for the record that my family, through Zoe Broadcasting Network, has an existing partnership with GMA Network, and I believe that I owe it to the public. Nevertheless, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I would like to assure our people and this august chamber that this will not deter this representation from ensuring that the provisions of the proposed franchise renewal will not be detrimental to public interest, but will ensure that we will be providing better service to the Filipino people. And with that, Mr. President, I would like to ask our distinguished sponsor if she would yield to just one issue that I would like to raise, because I have several issues here that were raised a while ago with regard to taxes, the value-added tax in lieu of franchise tax, the equality clause, and the likes. But I just have one issue that I'd like to raise, if the distinguished sponsor would yield to this representation.
Mr. President, I still have the airtime. I have not yielded, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Mr. President, mea culpa. I didn't realize that she was not through yet, but she left the rostrum, Mr. President, and I thought she sat down. You know, in the parliamentary procedures, even if you have the floor, once you sit down, you have to relinquish the floor.
Mr. President.
But I was mistaken, Mr. President.
I did not
so,
sit.
I'm sorry.
This representation would yield, Mr. President.
I'm sorry to
The
interrupt
chair takes note.
one of the youngest members of the House. No, because the reason why I stood and had a few steps is because Senator Lacson was asking me to verify how many other private commercial networks, radio or television or cable, have actually passed or renewed their franchises in the past. But we have a new chair, so we don't know. During the incumbency of the chair, just for the record.
For the chair, this is the first one.
It's the first one of the chair.
Yeah, so please,
You want to
Fast.
yield? You want me to yield?
let's speed it up.
Senator
Because,
Lacson is recognized.
You know, this concern was expressed to me by the resource person that we might be resorting to a class legislation if previous franchises were already granted by Congress, which will not be covered by the proposed amendment. That's why we are clarifying how many franchises have been granted by Congress.
Wow. There would be hundreds, I mean, yeah.
That will not be covered by the proposed amendment, in case we propose and adopt this amendment. That's my, because effectively,
That's why, Mr. President, I think it should be part of a separate law, because I believe that if it's broadcasting, for example, radio, I know that RMN had their franchise approved during the 16th Congress. I know that ABS-CBN will be up for renewal in the coming, I don't know when, but soon. So far, there's only one large network that has a pending franchise initiative, renewal.
Thank you, Senator Poe.
Oh, she sat down, Mr. President, ha? Nakita mo yun, ha?
To the
She
Majority
sat down.
Floor Leader, I think we have to,
She
Yes,
has to
Mr.
ask-
President.
She has to ask my permission now.
Yes, I ask, Mr. President, may I have 1 minute?
I have no
I
objection.
yielded.
I have no objection, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I yielded to Senator Lacson, that's why I sat. In fact, I'm done with my spiel, and I've been answered. So I thank the good sponsor for that, and I would support the renewal of the franchise of GMA 7.
thank you, Senator Legarda.
Senator,
Now, Mr. President, I was just kidding with the distinguished lady from Panay. May I now move to recognize Senator Joy Villanueva, finally.
Senator Villanueva is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Majority Floor Leader. But for the record, I don't intend to take the time of the distinguished lady, the chairperson of the Committee on Finance. Mr. President, as I was saying a while ago, would the distinguished sponsor yield to just one issue, Mr. President, that I'd like to raise, being the chairperson of the Committee on Labor and Employment and Human Resource Development. Because, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, this representation actually got a letter complaint from the Talents Association of GMA, or TAG, who were, according to them, deemed regular employees of GMA 7 and not independent contractors. And just to give a backgrounder, Mr. President, network talents are the technical and creative runners behind television shows, pitching stories, writing scripts and spills, producing audiovisual reports, shooting interviews, sourcing contracts and contributors, fact-checking stories, and finding case studies for stories, among others. I would just like to raise this issue, Mr. President, because as chair of the Committee on Labor, I would like to ask if these employers are actually being regularized, or what is now the status of the case, how the GMA Network treats and handles network talents, Mr. President?
Mr. President, that particular question of the good senator from Bulacan is part of a pending case with the Court of Appeals. But they are complying with labor, but they will definitely comply, of course. They have to comply with the decision of the court.
Definitely, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, that is the reason for raising this particular issue, to ensure that the network will be complying with labor laws, and that the rights of our workers are being preserved. May I just ask, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, if GMA Network is practicing endo or contractualization? Perhaps, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, my only concern is the fact that when this representation got this letter from Talents Association of GMA, the main concern is the fact that there are some networks, not only GMA for sure, that are practicing the evils of contractualization, yung pong 555 for instance. 5 months, after 5 months, tatanggalin, after 5 months, i-hire ulit, and it's gonna be over and over again, and the worst part is that they are not getting benefits, and considering that they are actually doing a regular a job, Mr. President.
Mr. President, in fact, the nature of the industry is such that it's a project basis most of the time, except for several permanent employees, let's say engineers in the network. But having a little bit knowledge of the industry also, you hire certain workers based on talent. So there's a particular time frame and a particular deliverable, which does not necessarily fall with the 555 that defines the ENDO arrangement.
So it's more of a project-based.
It's a project basis because you cannot make a commitment to hire the same director,
Yes.
the same writer, because their expertise and their talents may not be suitable to a particular subject matter to be produced.
Just to make sure, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, that we're on the same page. If,
Yeah.
for example, a network has a news and public affairs, Mr. President, the anchor or the reporter would fall under a regular employee, not a project-based employee. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, but I would like to clarify if there's a separate Senate meeting among Senate officers going on, Mr. President.
I'm sorry.
To the lady sponsor, thank you for reminding the chair. May we request the 4 highest officials in the Senate to sit down and to adjourn their separate plenary session, or at least to sit down.
This is based
So
on
that,
Mr. President, just to clarify matters, this is based on the our senior advisor senator here that the officers should take their seats as we are continuing with our interpellations. But your question about the news organization, I believe there are permanent. They have talent agreements also.
They are not considered project-based employees. Is that?
It depends, Mr. President. There are some anchors that are, they have a definite contract with the network, let's say a 3-year or 5-year contract. There are others that have per particular project basis. Again, because it's content that we are showing, it varies because there are certain subject matters or topics that are no longer relevant. And so actually the broadcasting industry is quite unique in that way.
Would the cameraman, for example, of a news agency be part of the regular employee, Mr. President?
Mr. President, for the news department, yes, I believe that most of
Yes,
their
I
cameramen are are actually permanently employed. But I believe that for their entertainment department, it depends on the teleserye that they are producing. They might need a specific cameraman with a specific expertise.
Thank
So
you,
it will
Mr.
be per
President.
project.
I fully agree with the sentiments of the distinguished sponsor. And again, this representation would just like to put on record that we just wanted to make sure that GMA complies with the labor laws and that the rights of our workers are being protected. And perhaps in the period of amendments, this representation would like to introduce some amendments to promote and protect the rights of our workers. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Senator Villanueva. Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move to close the period of interpellation on Senate Bill, or House Bill 4631 under Committee Report number 36.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, I will not open the period of individual and committee and individual amendments because I was told by the other members that they are still formulating the amendment. So we will propose it as soon as possible, Mr. President. So in the meantime, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill 4631 under Committee Report number 36.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, yeah. Senator Lacson just reminded me that on Wednesday, it's February 22, the anniversary. So if you're still sitting there on February 22, we will, that will send some chills to the spine of some members of the Senate, Mr. President.
The chair takes note. I hope this is not in retaliation for the chair calling the attention of the four highest officials in the Senate.
It is, Mr. President. Yeah, Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1256 under Committee Report Number 13.
Any objection? Hearing none?
Anti-money laundering. We have, may have 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
We're ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1256 under Committee Report Number 13.
Any objection? Hearing none?
And with the permission of the Chamber, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1304 under Committee Report Number 28.
Any objection? Hearing none?
Mr. President, this is the proposed measure on the free higher education for all. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we're now still in the period of interpellation, so I move to recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Education, Arts and Culture, Senator Bam Aquino, and to interpellate Senator Ralph Recto, the Minority Leader.
Senators Bam Aquino and the Minority Floor Leader, Senator Recto, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, first of all, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this measure for sponsoring this particular bill on the floor. And as the sponsor knows, I've been fighting for this for the last 2 or 3 Congresses. And in fact, in the committee report, I am listed as the principal author. Is
Yes.
that correct, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, and of course, we value the inputs of the good minority floor leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. In fact, Mr. President, you will recall that during the budget deliberations, again this year, we fought for this and we included this in the Senate version.
Yes,
There
Mr.
is an
President.
8.3 billion allocation in the Senate version, Mr. President. Now, having
Yes.
said that, what is the purpose of my interpolation? Of course, the purpose is to improve the bill so that we may include private higher educational institutions, not only public, and that there is a constitutional command on this as well. Now, having said that, Mr. President, the purpose of my interpellation is to ensure universal access to quality higher education by reducing costs for all students, whether public or private, Mr. President. Second, to improve the quality of tertiary education in both the public and private higher education institutions. Third is to recognize the complementary roles of both public and private institutions in the higher educational system. Fourth, to optimize the use of government resources in education. Fifth, to provide full tuition subsidy and educational assistance to all students enrolled in higher education institutions, whether public or private. Six, to simplify the process of availing for the free tuition subsidy and or educational assistance for tertiary students. 7, to ensure continuous funding for the free tuition subsidy program and educational assistance for tertiary students. And finally, to help ensure the sustainability of the free tuition subsidy program in the public sector. So this is the purpose of my interpellation, Mr. President. And we will propose the necessary amendments at the appropriate time. First question, Mr. President, is that are there any constitutional mandates pertaining to higher education?
Yes, Mr. President. Constitutional mandate. If I may just get the actual article and line, Mr. President.
And maybe I can help the
Yes,
sponsor
go ahead,
to
Mr.
have
President.
the
Go ahead.
constitutional mandate. Article 14 of the Constitution on Education provides that, Section 1, the state shall protect and promote the right of all citizens to quality education at all levels. Hindi primary, hindi secondary lang, ha? At all levels, and shall take appropriate steps to make such education accessible to all. Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. Section 2, the state shall establish, maintain, and support a complete, adequate, and integrated system of education relevant to the needs of the people and society. Nung araw kasi, Mr. President, kaya lang natin ang free elementary. And then later on, umabot free secondary. And my position has always been, kaya na natin, we have the fiscal space for tertiary education, Mr. President. Third, establish and maintain a system of scholarship grants, student loan programs, subsidies, and other incentives which shall be available to deserving students. So by merit, Mr. President, the serving students in both public and private schools.
Yes, Mr.
By
President.
merit, especially to the underprivileged. So dalawa to. By merit at yung para sa mahirap, Mr. President. And Section 5, Paragraph 2, academic freedom shall be enjoyed in all institutions of higher learning. Mr. President, let me begin by asking the distinguished sponsor, how many higher education institutions do we have? SUCs as well as private HEIs.
Mr. President, the SUCs are 112. And let me just get the number for the HEIs, Mr. President.
Okay. 112, does that include UP and PUP?
Yes, Mr. President.
Is it not 114?
Mr. President, there have been some schools which merged, Muscat and MUST, so it's now down to 112.
112. Okay, thank you. And the private higher education institutions, ilan naman yun?
Mr. President, you may have the number already. We're still trying to get it now.
Yes, 1,706. So it would appear here. Remember, the bill at hand only talks about public tertiary education.
Yes,
Only
Mr.
for
President.
112. What I want to do is include the 1,706 others, aside from the 112. And in the scheme of things, Mr. President, the HEIs, the private, is 88% of the total.
Yes, Mr. President,
Whereas the
88%.
SUCs, in terms of number only, is 12%. Is that correct, Mr.
That's
President?
correct, Mr. President. And if I may add, in terms of population, it's actually at 1.6 million for the SUCs and 2.2 million for the private schools. So even though it's 12% and 88% in terms of number, it's actually closer to 60-40 in terms of population, Mr.
So mas
President.
marami sa pribado kaysa
Yes,
sa
Mr.
publiko.
President.
And that's why it's important for the sustainability of the program, we also address the private educational institutions.
Yes, Mr.
So
President.
that is the purpose of my interpellation, Mr. President, among others. So moving forward, Mr. President, where are the private higher education institutions located?
All over the Philippines, Mr. President.
Right. Could we have a map of this, for example? And why is this important? Are they in 81 provinces and 150 cities?
Yes, Mr. President. In most of the provinces and most of the cities, you will find the tertiary level education system, Mr.
Yeah.
President.
They are not all in all provinces and cities, Mr. President. The same question now will apply not only with regard to the private SUCs or the private higher education institutions, but also the SUCs. Ilan ba yan? 112. Where are they located? Are they in all provinces? Are they in all cities? Why is that relevant, Mr. President? In areas na walang SUC, pribado lang ang nandun, we must have a system in place to provide deserving and poor students access to higher education.
Yes, Mr. President.
In areas na may SUC at meron private higher education institution, pag ginawa mong libre yung pampubliko, yung estudyante sa pribado lilipat sa publiko, baka hindi sustainable. And that's why it's important to map this out. Kasi competition din yan eh.
Yes, Mr. President.
That's how this representation looks at it. And therefore, may we get this data from the CHED. Where are they located so we can design such a program in the bill to provide what subsidies we can get? Because under the bill, may limit din tayo in the bill for the SUCs.
Yes, Mr.
We want to
President.
ensure that our SUCs have the best quality possible. And that's what we're saying, there must be a limit in how many students they should accept.
Yes, Mr. President.
There must be an entrance exam.
Yes, Mr. President.
Hindi naman pwede na lahat ng gusto pumasok, papasok lang.
Yes, Mr.
Di ba
President.
ba?
Yes.
Okay? And that's why I'm saying there is enough resources to do this also in the private education institutions. So the first that we must do is identify where are the schools, where are the private higher education institutions, where are the SUCs, where are they competing, where are the areas na walang SUC, eto pribado lang to dito, lugi naman yung probinsyang yan kung walang SUC, higher education, private lang ang nandun, there must be a system in place as well.
Yes, Mr. President. In fact, Mr. President, there's a system in place to provide resources to our private HEIs. And if you remember, Mr. President, we all supported the Unifast law in the last Congress. There's a provision actually, Mr. President, in our law that refers to the STUFAPs under the
Yes,
Unifast
I'm
law.
familiar with that. We will get to that, Mr.
Yes.
President. I do have questions on that. The
Mr.
idea
President,
is-
just to put on the record that there are actually...
If I may first put this on the record, because we will get to that, Mr.
Yes,
President.
Mr. President.
We are familiar, later on I will ask, the total scholarship grant. We will get to that. The total scholarship grant. Kasi halimbawa today, we put in the budget for 2017, 8.3 billion para libre na yung SUCs. Yung tuition sa SUCs for the first
Semester.
semester. Okay? Meron pang stufap yan. Magkano ba yan? It could be a high of 10 billion to even more, 19 billion.
Yes,
So
Mr.
kung
President.
tutusin mo, we can also provide. That's why I'm saying there is money. We can provide another 8 billion also for the private sector if necessary.
Yes, Mr. President.
That is the point that I will drive at later on. So now that we first have to determine where are the schools, maybe the CHED can supply
Yes.
us the information. The next point is, ilan ba ang estudyante sa SUCs?
Yes, Mr. President, the total number of students in our SUCs is 1.648566 or 1.6,048,566, Mr. President.
What year is this, Mr. President?
This is the 2015-2016 school year, Mr. President.
Okay. But that is not the undergraduate, di ba? What is the undergraduate degree?
That is the undergraduate degree, Mr. President.
Our numbers are different here, Mr. President.
Chair, this year, Mr. President.
I think your numbers include those taking a master's degree. Because iba naman yung free public college tuition dun sa undergrad lang. Iba pa naman yung ibang subsidy for the masters, for the PhD on the public sector. Iba rin naman yan sa privado.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, may I have your numbers, Mr. President? What is your number for the undergrads?
For the undergrad, it's 1.2 million. 1202849 for 2016-2017. But the point is this, no? So, we have to know also, ilan ba yung kliyente natin dito?
Yes, Mr. President.
How many students
may
do we
I-
have?
May I hazard a guess
Yeah.
why your numbers are lower? Because, Mr. President, my numbers are the previous year, your numbers are the current year, and we have lower enrollment for freshmen
I
because
know.
of K-12.
Yeah,
So,
we'll get to that too.
yes, I think, Mr. President, our numbers are both correct, no?
No, actually, it's still different. For 2015 to 16, it's 1387.
Oh, we'll check that, Mr.
Yes.
President.
Because the difference is that we're counting there including the master's degree and the PhD. My initial purpose is the free public college muna for the ipapasok ng kolehiyo.
Yes,
We
Mr.
will get to
President.
that later on the master's and the PhD. Okay? Now, in the private naman, how many students do we have in the private?
Okay, Mr. President, let me share with you my numbers. 2.219857, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
that's for 2015 and 2016. Correct. Okay, we have the same numbers there.
All right, thank you,
Okay,
Mr.
but the
President.
point is this, Mr. President. In our bill, it only talks about free public college tuition. We are leaving out the 2.2 million. That's the point. And that's the purpose of our interpolation and amendment, to include the private education institutions as well.
Mr. President, if I may clarify,
Yes.
we do have a provision that upholds the STUFAP, which is found in the Unifast law. And this money, Mr. President, a significant portion of that can be accessed through the private
I
schools.
understand. But the question is this. We will get to that, Mr. President. I hope the sponsor becomes patient with this representation.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. President.
Gawin natin maliwanag. Magkano bang binibigay natin sa pampubliko? How much do we give to the SUCs? How much will we give to UP, for example? And how much for the private?
Mr.
Para
President.
maliwanag, hindi yung bahala na si CHED. That's
Yes.
the point that I'm trying to drive at here. Kung bibilangin natin, we'll know more or less.
Yes.
We can design the law.
We can, Mr. President, now if I
That
may.
is the purpose of my interpolation.
Yes, and Mr. President, I'm not disagreeing with you,
Yes.
but maybe just to clarify for the record, what the purpose of our law initially, no, maybe before your amendments, Mr. President, is really to fund our SUCs.
Correct.
This does not discriminate upon the private sector.
Correct. And I agree with you, yes.
Because, Mr. President,
Okay.
in our laws, we also have funds which can be accessed through the private sector.
Correct.
But not specifically for the private sector.
Yeah, we will get to that, Mr. President.
Yes.
Because how much do we spend today in the private sector?
Yes, Mr. President. All I'm saying, Mr. President, is that what we currently have are funds which can be used for the private sector, but if
Yeah.
the...
Precisely my point, Mr. President. We are not spending as much as we should. Okay na tayo sa free public. I'm extending this now to include private. Today, I will ask the question at the appropriate time, magkano na pupunta sa privado? And I'm saying if we look at them as partners in educating our children, then we should provide also the additional resources. That's the point. Remember, government here, lahat ito subsidy. Bibigay natin sa SUC, which I support. And precisely that is the purpose of my bill. Okay? But realizing the huge fiscal space we have, we can mandate under the STUFA program how much should be given to the private. Let me give an example, Mr. President. Sa National High School, how many students do we have in secondary school today?
About 1.5 million enrolled, Mr. President.
Secondary?
That's for senior high school, Mr. President.
No, lahat. First to fourth year, ilan?
Sorry, Mr. President. From
Grade 7 to 12. Total, oh. In the public school and ilan yung sa privado. And then the next question will be, how much subsidy do we give the private schools? We are buying seats in the private
Yes,
high
through the
schools.
GASPE program.
Through
Mr.
the
President.
GASPE.
Yes.
And that's the point I'm making. Why not have similar to GASPE for tertiary college, for tertiary education?
Why not, Mr. President?
And that's the purpose of our amendments. So again, just to enrich the record. So ilan ang estudyante natin sa high school? Sa public, ilan yung sa private? How much are we spending sa GASPE sa privado?
Look yung GASPE program. The debt Mr. President, can I get a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President?
Session suspended.
So how many percent is GASPE sa total students? No, lahat ng GASPE, we're paying them in private schools. So GASPE is 35 billion. So how many students in private, how many in public? How much per student on the subsidy? In GASPE? Diba? That gives you a number for the tertiary.
This is grade.
High school lang, sir. Secondary. 6 million.
Plus net, plus. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Mr. President, for secondary, we have 6.17 million students. for senior high school, we have about 1.5 million students, Mr. President.
So, all in all,
Around 7.6, Mr. President.
Million.
7.6 million students.
total na yun.
Yes, and then for GASPE, Mr. President, we're spending 32 billion for this year.
Okay. And how many students are we subsidizing in private schools? So 32 billion yung subsidy natin
1.5 million.
for high school or secondary school. We are buying them seats in the private secondary schools.
Yes, Mr. President.
So ilan yun?
Let me just crunch the numbers, Mr. President. 32 billion over 24,000.
So how many?
Billion over million. 36 billion over 1.5 billion. Yeah, but that includes secondary, senior high school.
So what's the percentage?
Or that's just senior high school. No, senior,
35%.
GASPE is all, from elementary to up.
Secondary is 7.5. So 2.6 is in the private. One point three. Almost 4 million.
2 billion for the whole program. So how many students? Well,
Ito hindi pa kasama dito yung gas. 1.3. Oo.
Pagka high school, kapag regular basic ed, mas mababa siya than senior high school is how many students will you bigyan? To break it down. Mr. President, can I get a 1-minute suspension?
Session suspended.
We just get the numbers.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Yes, Mr. President, I think the Minority Floor Leader also has some numbers he'd like to share.
Thank you, Mr. President. We just run the numbers, Mr. President. We have roughly 7.5 billion students in our high schools. That's both public and private. Okay? We spend 35.8 billion for GASPE, subsidizing 2.6 million students in the private sector. The per capita is roughly 13,800 per student. In addition to that, I'm not even counting under K-12, there are 1.3 million students in our public schools that we're paying for their vocational training in private schools.
Yes.
So, lumalabas, 50% ng lahat ng estudyante, binabayaran na rin ng gobyerno, may subsidy to enter private schools. Okay, so there's that partnership. And what I'm saying is that based on these numbers, we can do the same for tertiary education.
Yes, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Now, moving forward, do we have a ranking of all SUCs and private higher education institutions in terms of enrollment and quality of education?
Mr. President, in terms of enrollment, we could get that. In terms of quality, Mr. President, there's no current ranking that puts everybody together.
The reason why we want to get this data is so that we know how big the schools are based on their
How big,
enrollment.
Mr. President, we have
Yeah.
that. But with regard
based
to
on the
quality,
enrollment.
we don't have that
So
compared
CHED
to
does
each
not
other.
have a system in place to determine the quality of our higher education institutions and SUCs?
There's a parallel, yeah, Mr. President, for SUCs, yes. For private, yes, but not together. So there's a parallel ranking
But
system
aren't
that they
they
have.
regulated by CHED, both the private and the public?
Yes, Mr. President, but this is a debate, Mr. President, that keeps on coming up because of the academic freedom clause, and some SUCs, of course, have their own charters. But we're of the position, Mr. President, that CHED should release rankings for everyone. What they do now, Mr. President, is a parallel ranking. So you have your SUCs, which have different levels, Then you have your private institutions with also different levels.
Could we have that, whatever rankings we may have?
Yes, Mr.
To
President.
determine? Kasi kung fly-by-night yung SUC na yan, hindi na dapat tumanggap ng subsidy galing sa gobyerno yan.
Mr. President, I wouldn't
Diploma
say
mill yung SUC na yan.
Mr. President, I wouldn't say fly by night, but we could say underperforming. Because
Or,
most of them,
like
Mr.
I said,
President,
kung
are...
walang natututunan yung bata dyan, nagbabayad ng, gumagastos yung pamilya, yung mga magulang, wala naman palang natututunan, hindi na rin dapat kumuha ng subsidy yan sa gobyerno, whether private or public.
Well, Mr. President, we did put a provision in the law where we asked them to submit data, which previously they weren't submitting, regarding board passing, employability of students,
And I
which could
welcome
help
that.
us
Correct. And I
determine their proficiency, Mr.
Now,
President.
the reason why I asked this is that trabaho ng CHED yan eh. They've not done that throughout the years because we will ask them to administer this.
Yes, Mr. President,
And
that's
I'm
been...
glad that you put that provision in the bill.
We can put that provision in the bill, Mr. President. We have a similar provision already there, but we would welcome your amendments, Mr.
Yes.
President.
No, but my point is that I support the provision in the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President.
And I'm just surprised that the CHED till today does not have SATs.
Mr. President, throughout this whole 7-month process, we've had a lot of difficulty just getting basic data, Mr. President.
Okay. Now, how many are unable to enter college because they lack money, Mr.
So,
President?
Mr. President, for SUCs, that's 46%. Mr. President, okay, I have another set of figures here from PIDS, but if I'm not mistaken, from another data set, it's about 46%, Mr. President.
So 46% of those who graduate high school is willing to go to college, but unable because
I'm sorry, Mr. President.
Yes,
What the number I gave you were why students drop out of college. If it's from high school to college, Mr. President, I'm not sure we have that data, but I do know that it's about 4 out of 10, Mr. President, who proceed to
40%,
college.
40%.
Who proceed to college.
Correct. Who proceed?
Yes, out
The
of 10
6
students,
out of
Mr.
10
President.
did not proceed.
Yes, Mr. President.
So how many of the 6 out of 10 did not proceed to college
Because
they don't have the resources?
No one does that interview yet, Mr. President. What we do have are those who enter college, the 4 that enter college, eventually drop out, and a significant percentage of that drops out because of a lack of finances, Mr. President.
If we have this bill, those issues will be addressed. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
So doon
Hopefully.
naman mali ang CHED, and why are they opposing this measure?
Well, Mr. President,
When the data is clear that 40% of those who want to enter college cannot enter because they don't have the resources. And ayaw pa nila ng free public college tuition.
Mr.
And
President,
46% of those already in college drop out because they don't have the wherewithal to continue with education.
Mr. President, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but if I may share some data, we found that the issue with CHED and eventually with PIDS as well was because of their appreciation of poor. When they said poor, Mr. President, only 12% of the poor get to the SUCs. They were referring to the poorest of the poor or the lowest income bracket that we have in the Philippines. This would also be the 4-piece families, Mr. President. And the gentleman from Batangas, of course, knows very few of them get to college because the interventions for this sector is really at the K-12 level. But if you look, Mr. President, at about 70% up to 80% of the families who put their children through the SUCs, many of them are at the poorest of the poor and near poor levels. So in short, Mr. President, I think the issue with CHED came up because they were only looking at the lowest 10% of the Philippines, while we were looking, Mr. President, at who actually needs the help and needs the support.
Okay. So, in effect, we're saying that who will benefit from this, hindi lang yung mahirap na mahirap, yung mahirap at yung magiging mahirap o yung middle class.
At yung
Lower
hirap,
middle
Mr.
class.
President. Opo.
Di ba? Okay. And that's why it's very important that we pass this bill?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. Now, moving forward, Mr. President, what is the total cost of public tertiary education per student in the SUC level?
Mr. President, the total cost and not just the tuition fee? Mr. President,
Yes.
are
No,
we referring to the total cost or just the tuition fee
the
cost?
total cost, Mr. President? Halimbawa, just to give an example.
Roughly around 60,000, Mr. President. A year.
It's much lower than that, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we included the transportation cost and living expenses. That's the figure that we have,
Okay.
Mr. President.
No. I was talking about the budget, the subsidy. Halimbawa, I'll give you an example, Mr. President. There are in fiscal year 2014 to 2015, tanggalin ko yung UP, yung 110 lang.
Yes, Mr.
na
President.
SUCs. 1.2 million estudyante. Ang budget, 42 billion. The cost per student then is 34,000.
Yes, Mr. President.
Diba?
W-
The subsidy. And then, they collect tuition fee from them.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? Doon natin kinuha yung 8 billion para wag na silang mag-collecta. In effect, if you give the 8, it's 42 plus the 8, it becomes 50 billion divided by 1.2. That would be the cost per student.
Yes, Mr. President.
Right? Okay, now. So, if the cost for all the other SUCs, so, halimbawa, in the case of 2017, 16 to 17, the budget increased to 58.7 billion. The budget of the SUCs as appropriated
Yes.
by Congress. But you have the same number of students. The cost per student increased.
Yes, Mr. President. And this is the
48.
facilities, Mr. President. There were new facilities made, new improvements to the schools, Mr. President.
Correct. Okay. Now, it becomes 48,000, and this is where we got the 8 billion naman later on, di ba? Okay, now, I just wanted to compare, and then the question is now, for this type of student in the SUCs outside of UP, okay, what is the level of income?
For
What
a
is the family income and expenditure survey or level of income of students not enrolled in UP but in an SUC?
Mr. President, 79% of the families are earning 16,000 pesos or less.
Okay. Yung ba mayaman ba yun?
Hindi, Mr. President.
Okay.
Hinding hindi.
So, 16,000 pesos
Or less.
pababa.
For 79%, Mr. President.
Roughly 80% of the 1.2 million students in our SUCs.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, and we're subsidizing them with 48,000 a year.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, for their schooling. Now, punta naman tayo sa UP. How many students does UP have?
Mr. President, 71,507
What
in the
year was
whole
that?
UP system.
That includes masters and doctors, Mr. President.
Mr. President, let me try to see if I have this aggregated. Are you talking about just Diliman and Manila, Mr. President, or
Yes.
all of the UPs?
Yes. All UP system, tanggalin mo lang yung masters at doctors lang. You know, as an aside, while you're looking at the data, baka naman gusto ng CHED, ayaw nila ng free public college tuition. Not because of whether they're rich or poor, but they're protecting private college institutions naman.
I don't know, Mr. President. Oh, I don't think so, Mr. President.
The number, roughly, Mr. President, let me share with you our data.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. President.
In the UP, roughly, you have 40,000 students, undergrad. Okay? If the budget is 13.5 billion, which it is in 2016 to 17, the per capita, the subsidy of the state to a student in UP is 320,000 pesos.
Yes, Mr. President.
student.
It is much higher.
Compare it to the SUC outside of UP at 48,000. Okay? Now, ang income level is 16,000 pababa. What is the family income? The average family income of a student in UP naman?
We don't have that right now, Mr. President. We could get it for you, of course, Mr. President.
It's much,
but it's
much
much higher than 16,000, Mr. President.
It's something like 700,000 a year. I don't mind giving them the subsidy. I don't mind. All I'm saying is that we have to do a catch-up with these other SUCs.
Yes, Mr. President.
Hindi ko sasabi, bawasan natin to. Para ibigay dito, sasabi ko, dagdagan natin tong iba. The SUC.
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, would you have the data also for the PUP?
Mr. President, for PUP, but again, this includes the masteral students, 79,372. They actually have the most enrollment, Mr. President. They're higher than UP.
Correct. Yung undergrad nila is 58,000 for 2016-17. Their subsidy is only 23,000 per student. Even lower
On the lower side, Mr.
than the
President.
other SUCs. So it's a big disparity between the subsidy given to a UP student, a student from another SUC in the provinces,
And the
and
PUP
lower
student.
pa for PUP. Okay, so this is something that I suppose we should look into. No? Now, moving forward, Mr. President, how much is the total funds appropriated for all forms of student financial assistance programs, TUFAP, for tertiary education administered by the different government agencies? Magkano ba talaga ang total budget ng lahat ng scholarship ng gobyerno? In addition to these budgets on subsidies sa UP, sa PUP, sa SUC,
Yes, Mr. President. Above and beyond all of those.
above and beyond all of this. And who are the government agencies administering these funds?
Okay. Mr. President, it's 13.7 billion. And the agencies are, of course, CHED with 5.6 billion, DOST with 2.2 billion, DA with about 1.6 billion, DSWD 1.5 billion, DOH 1.3 million, TESDA 440 million, DENR 385 million, DILG 364 million, OP at 59 million, DOLE 57 million, PCA 21.8 million, PSC at 54.7 million, NCIP at 39 million, SRA 10.7 million, GSIS 9 million, DND 8.1 million, OPAP 5.5 million, OWA at 11.3 million, and NCMF at 2 million, Mr. President. This is what we have.
So how many government agencies administer?
19, Mr. President.
19 government agencies administering scholarship programs. And the total of which is 13 billion.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. How much of that goes to the public sector and how much goes to the private sector?
We don't have that data, Mr. President. But even Unifast, Mr. President, the board, they don't have that data.
Okay.
So it is a potential, potentially it could be used for the private sector, Mr. President, but there's no way right now to tell.
Precisely. We know the amounts.
Yes.
We know kalat-kalat ang gobyerno. There are 19 agencies.
Yes, Mr. President.
And the resources are huge. That's 13 billion. How much did we put this year for the free public college tuition?
8.3.
Plus the 13, magkano yun? So
21, Mr. President.
So the total universe is 21 billion.
Yes, Mr. Currently budgeted, Mr.
Currently
President.
budgeted. Okay? So in 21, pwedeng gawin natin, ito sa public, ito yung sa private. 10-10 or something like that.
It's possible, Mr. President,
possible.
or we can, well, Mr. President, if I may, no, the Unifast, Mr. President, and the STUFAPs are not just for tuition. They're sometimes used for miscellaneous
I know, I
expenses,
understand
for
that. I
living
understand that.
expenses.
Like I said, pwede naman gawin, ito yung public, ito yung private. And that's why it's important for us to be able to design the bill properly. To find out from CHED and these 19 agencies, we know that there's 13 billion. Kalat-kalat.
Yes. Mr.
Magulo.
President,
And we don't even know how much is spent for public. Halimbawa, yung free public college tuition is just for the tuition. But the student is still eligible to get from STUFAP
yes, Mr. President.
for miscellaneous fees, to purchase books, pang
Even living expenses,
living
Mr. President.
expenses, so on and so forth, right?
Yes.
Okay. I have no problem with that. But we have to know, we're spending taxpayers' money. How much goes to public, how much goes to private? Now, I will not stop there, Mr. President, because that's just 21 billion. How much is the budget this year, Mr. President?
Budget for
National government,
3.3 trillion, Mr. President.
actually 3.4 trillion. What will the budget be next year?
Maybe another 10% increase, Mr. President.
Roughly 3.8 trillion.
Yes, Mr. President.
So there's about 400 billion next year.
Yes, Mr.
Ano
President.
ba naman na 10, 20 billion ilagay natin?
Even just 5%, Mr. President, for tertiary level
So
education.
there is enough fiscal space.
Yes, Mr. President. We agree completely, Mr.
We do
President.
not need to stop at 20 billion. We
Yes,
can
Mr.
put
President.
30 billion. Or
Yes,
even
Mr.
more.
President. Yes.
Huh? So that is the purpose of our interpolation.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? So maybe the staff can provide us this data, and let's push CHED to find out how much goes to public, how much goes to private.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Now, what are the other expenses?
Mr. President, you have what we call other expenses as defined in the bill, which includes other school fees, which includes medical, dental, laboratory, library, athletic, and miscellaneous fees, Mr. President. That's within the school.
Yeah.
Then you also have the living expenses, transportation expenses, Mr. President, other expenses to ensure that you can actually go to school.
So this is, so the free public college tuition is just 30%, more
Yes.
or less,
Yes, Mr.
of
President.
the total expenses. No? And this is not a dole out because the student has to pass the test.
Yes, Mr.
The
President.
student must pass every semester. So
Mr. President,
it is merit-based.
that is the Gordon amendment that he wishes to propose, Mr. President, and we will accept that, Mr. President.
No, it is merit-based. If you don't pass your entrance exam to begin with,
Yes, Mr.
you're
President.
not eligible for this free public college tuition.
Yes, but the current version, Mr. President, only refers to an entrance exam. So, through our interpolations, Mr. President, with other colleagues, they do want to put a
Correct.
intermittent check on your grades, Mr.
No, of
President.
course. For example, bagsak ka. Eh bakit babayaran ng Estado yung pag-aaral mo kung bagsak ka?
Yes, actually, Mr.
It
President.
must be merit-based.
Yes, Mr. President, and we are willing to accept these amendments, Mr. President.
Okay? Now, would you know if the 112 SUCs are profitable? May profit and loss statement ba yung mga yan? Do they have retained earnings?
Mr. President, I don't think they're allowed to accept retained earnings because they're not corporations, but
No, I'm just using the term retained earnings, but the idea is, are they profitable?
they can carry over any excess cash that they may have, Mr. President. I'm just worried about calling it profit, Mr. President, because that's not the nature of their, that's not the status of their charter. But if they have excess money, they can roll it over and use it for other things, Mr. President, the following year.
Okay. Now, the point is this. They must have financial statements.
Yes, they do, Mr. President.
Okay? And whether it's government or private, you do have financial statements. You can determine, in the private, we call it profitability. In the
Yes.
public, we can call it different. But then it still would determine whether they are profitable, or we can use another term for that, and whether or not they have retained earnings.
Yes, Mr.
You
President.
need to say may surplus.
Yes.
Di ba? Okay? Now, would you have the financial statements of the 112 SUCs? Meron.
In aggregate. Mr. President, in aggregate, we do have it. Are you referring to each and every one, or in
I'm sure
aggregate?
the CHED would have each and every one, right? But you would have an aggregate.
Yes, they would have, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
for
I have the
our
aggregate.
purpose of the aggregate, di ba? So, based on the aggregate, how much were their revenues last year?
This is in billions, no? Mr. President, their ending balance is about 25 billion, Mr. President. 25.7 billion.
Okay.
This is their internally generated income,
Okay,
less expenditures.
correct. So, may income minus expenditures, yun yung parang profitability nila. Okay?
Yes, Mr. President.
So, maraming perang SUCs pala. They have a surplus of 25 to 27, 26 billion pesos.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? And that 25 to 26 billion pesos can be used, bibigyan pa natin ng subsidy this year na 8 billion eh.
Yes, Mr. President.
That can be used to improve their facilities.
Yes, Mr. President.
So we can write that in the law also to improve the quality of our public SUCs.
That they can use their surplus earnings for their own development.
Correct.
Yes, Mr. President.
A percentage of that
Yes.
for capital outlay. Now's
Yes.
the time to do it.
Yes, Mr.
Improve their
President.
quality. Di ba? Okay. So, may we have the same data also for UP? Would you have the data for UP? Are they profitable? Are they, may surplus ba sila? May retained earnings ba?
We can acquire that for you, Mr. President. We just don't have it on hand.
My initial look is that they have 12 billion.
Okay, Mr. President. Thank you for that.
Okay? So, okay. So it would be good to use some of this for their capital outlay as well. We could probably write that in the law as well.
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, because of K to 12, in 2015-16, you have 4 years. 2016-17, first year implementation, walang first year college.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? If the budget, and then on 17-18, third and fourth year na lang.
Yes, Mr. President.
So, in your SUCs, more or less, 50% na lang ang estudyante mo.
Yes, Mr. President. For the next few years, Mr. President.
Okay. No, yeah. Okay. 50% na lang ang estudyante mo. Walang papasok sa first, walang papasok sa second.
Well, Mr. President, wala in the sense napaka-konti if ever meron.
Correct.
Yes.
So, more or less 50% mababawasan ang estudyante mo.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? Now, that will be a big problem in the private sector.
Yes, Mr.
Because
President.
the SUCs get a subsidy naman eh. The private, wala eh.
Yes.
Diba? And that's why it's important to assist also the private sector.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, now, in 2018 and 19, again, you will only have fourth year graduating and first year.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, so 50% of the students, wala.
Yes.
Both in the public and in the private.
Yes.
Okay? In 2019 to 2020, you have no graduating students. You will only have first year and second year.
Mr. President, could you repeat that, Mr. President?
Yeah, by 2015 to 16, you have 4 years. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes.
That's your total universe of students. 2016 to 17, first year implementation of K to 12, wala ka ng first year student.
Yes, just 2,
Second,
3, 4.
third, and fourth.
Yes.
Pagdating ng 2017-18, third and fourth na lang.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? Pagdating ng 2018 to 19, fourth year and first year na lang. Yung gagraduate na ng K-12, magiging first
Yes.
year.
Yes, Mr. President. Yes.
Right? Okay? And then in 2019 to 2020,
1 and 2.
1 and 2 na lang. So for the next 3 years, 50% na lang ang estudyante mo,
Yes, Mr. President.
both in public and private.
Yes.
So hindi problema as far as the government is concerned because there's a subsidy from the national government. The biggest problem is with the private.
Yes.
And that's why it's important we have certain provisions here.
Yes.
Di ba?
Yes,
But it will
Mr.
not
President.
cost that much because 50% na lang eh.
Yes, Mr. President.
And in fact, now is the time to prepare. Now is the time to build your infrastructure. Hindi na maraming estudyante. Hindi na puno yung eskwelahan. You can build now your dorm facilities, additional classrooms.
Yes, Mr.
Preparing it for the following years, then you'll have full enrollment again. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr.
That's how
President.
important.
It
that
gives
we
us
can
some breathing
incorporate-
space, Mr. President.
That's how important in discussing this bill, we're aware of all of this, so we can incorporate it in the bill,
Yes, Mr. President.
right? Okay? And then in 2021, so in effect, for 2 years din, walang graduating student. By 2019 to 20 and 2020 to 21. Kasi you'll have first, second, and third.
Yes, Mr. President.
So an additional 25%. But on 2021 to 2022, full year na.
Yes.
So
We're
that's
back
our
to 4
target
years, Mr.
rate.
President.
That's our target year. Now, by that time, adequate na yung facilities and so on and so forth.
And by that time, Mr. President, our budget would have probably doubled already, and if we're increasing by 10% a year. So we should have adequate resources, Mr. President, by then.
Correct. And it's cheaper to do it now, in that sense. And wiser to do it at this point in time. Now, okay. One of the problems that PIDS is saying, well, actually, they've not said it, including CHED, is their real concern should be, hindi yung sa their argument na it's
Anti-poor.
pro-rich, it's
Yes, Mr.
anti-poor.
President.
The biggest issue is if you provide free public college tuition, people in the private sector will move to the public sector. That is the biggest issue. Okay? I hope that's how they looked at it instead of saying na
Well,
pro-rich tong bill na to.
They focused, Mr. President, on the anti-poor stance, which we already refuted. We did try to provide some safeguards, Mr. President, which we also discussed with the private sector, and that is that the SUCs must get approval before they increase their capacity, Mr. President. And that's probably one safeguard, Mr. President, to ensure that they don't overbloat or they don't accept too many students from the private schools, and that we don't see that massive migration that PIDS actually talked about.
Okay. Now, there's a provision in the bill, which is a good provision, requiring SUCs are mandated to fulfill the following before accessing the fund. Determine and publish the maximum number of students.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. Do we have an idea already of what this is?
Mr. President, well, anecdotally, everyone says that they have so many students, so we put a provision, Mr. President, that will assume that that is the current enrollment of this year, Mr. President.
Okay. But I'm sure the Chet would have an idea of ano ba yung maximum na pwedeng tanggapin ng mga SEC natin. Mabibilang mo naman yung upuan dyan eh. And then if you follow the 40 students per classroom,
Mr. President, the numbers that we have now are self-reported. So CHED actually wants to do an audit of the facilities to have a better number or have a better peg on
Okay.
the maximum capacity.
when do you think will they have that, Mr. President?
Mr. President, as soon as we pass our bill and mandate it, I'm sure that they'll be...
No, I think they should do it right now as we're discussing it so that
Yes,
we
Mr.
can
President.
do the appropriations properly.
And we're prepared also, Mr. President.
Correct. Magkano ba talaga ang kailangan, di ba? Okay? Because like I said, there might be those in the private sector who may want to go to the public sector if there's no facility available for them.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay? So we will work that out during the period of amendments. No? Okay. For today, maybe finally, one final question for today. In terms of tax treatment, okay? You have private higher educational institutions that are, how many types are there? Meron yung religious. Di ba? Yung religious, walang tax yun.
Yes, Mr. President, wala po. There's
Yung-
for-profit, Mr. President.
And then yung, pag SUC, walang tax din yun.
Yes. You also have the LUC, Mr. President,
What is an LUC?
local LCU, local college or university, Mr. President.
May accreditation naman sa CHED din yan, di ba? They cannot be a diploma mill, right?
Yes, Mr. President, there's accreditation.
Accreditation.
And you also have the TechVoc schools, which are considered
Yun, walang tax
HEIs.
din yun.
Wala po, Mr. President.
Okay, and then the TechVoc, yun may tax ba yun?
Mr. President, it also depends if they're for-profit or not.
So some private educational institutions that are not religious are for profit,
Yes, Mr.
and
President.
therefore they're taxable. Is
Yes,
that
Mr.
correct?
President. Yes.
So there seems to be some unfair treatment as far as education is concerned. Na ito taxable, ito non-taxable.
Yes, Mr. President, if you look
In
at
that sense.
unfair as different treatment across different schools, then yes,
Oo,
there is
diba?
different treatments.
Okay, so maybe we can look at that at the appropriate time too.
Yes, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, for now, I will stop my interpolation, but I think it will be easy for us to work with the sponsor of this bill, knowing fully well now the type of amendments that this representation will like to
Yes,
make.
and in fact, Mr. President, we will welcome the amendments from the gentleman who, of course, has been pushing for this for some time. Definitely, Mr. President, there was no intention not to support the private sector. It's just that there
Yes, I
already
understand
were
that. Yes.
provisions which allowed for their support. But if we need to define that further or increase the budget,
Yes.
we'll be more than happy to do that, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for the patience of the sponsor of this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Recto. Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the meantime, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1304. No, wait, Mr. President, may I have a 1-minute suspension?
Session suspended.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
As I was saying, Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1304 under Committee Report 28.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, to speak on a matter of public interest, may we recognize Senator Sari Trillanes.
Senator Trillanes is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This morning, a press conference was held here in the Senate wherein SPO3 Arthur Las Cañas publicly confessed and implicated no less than President Rodrigo Duterte to several incidents of murder, contract killing, and assassinations when he was still mayor of Davao City. According to Las Cañas, these ghastly acts were carried out mainly by police officials under the guise of legitimate police operations which were never resolved. The revelation of SPO3 Las Cañas is a big break in the quest for the truth behind the so-called Davao Death Squad. In view of the foregoing, I move that this privileged speech be referred to the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs so that it could investigate and inquire into the matter in aid of legislation. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank Majority Floor Leader.
Anong sinabi?
Thank you, Senator Trillanes. Majority Floor Leader.
I have no objection to the motion to refer what he mentioned to the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs, except perhaps that somehow we should just inform the Committee on Justice also, just for information purposes, so that they know that there is an issue somehow related to a committee report that they came up with. So I have no objections, Mr. President, to the motion.
Can this be translated into a formal motion?
Yes, I move that we refer the privilege speech of the gentleman from Bicol to the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs as he has requested, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn the session until Tuesday, 3 o'clock p.m. of Tuesday. Usapan natin sandali. 3 p.m. of Tuesday, February 21, 2017. And I hope the presiding officer will be here until February 22, unless there is a coup d'etat, Mr. President.
Thank you very much to the Majority Floor Leader for being that considerate. Is there any objection? Hearing none, the session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, 21 February 2017.